Important Acts of the British Parliament. Important Acts of the British Parliament concerning India during the days of the East India Company. The British Parliament passed many acts right from the days of the East India Company, all aiming at stabilizing the company rule, facilitating expansion, exploiting the Indian resources to the advantage of the company and the British in general. It also passed acts to curb and prevent revolts against the British rule. The following are the important acts. The first act is the Regulating Act of 1773. The Regulating Act of 1773 was enacted by the British Parliament to control the company's administration in India. It formally recognized the Parliament's right to control Indian affairs. Under the Act, the Court of Directors of the company were obliged to submit all communications received from Bengal about civil, military and revenue matters in India to the British government. Even territories in India were subjected to some degree of centralized control. The status of the Governor of Bengal was raised to that of the Governor General. The East India Company was given power to supervise and control the presidencies of Madras and Bombay. Under this, they could decide in the matters of waging war or making peace with the Indian states except in emergency situations. A Supreme Court was also set up in Calcutta, and the Governor General was given the power of making laws. The second act is the Pitt's India Act of 1784. Under this act, the Parliament made a provision for appointing a board of control. The board would superintend, direct, and control all acts, operations, and concerns related to the civil or military government or revenues of the British territorial possessions in the East Indies. The order of the board became binding on the Court of Directors. They were required to send all its letters and dispatches to the board for its perusal. Only its public affairs and its administration in India were brought under more direct governmental control. The third act is the Charter Act of 1793. This act renewed the charter of the company for 20 years, giving it possession of all territories in India during that period. All laws were to be printed with translations in Indian languages so that people would know their rights, privileges, and immunities. The fourth act is the Charter Act of 1813. The Charter Act of 1813 renewed the company's charter for 20 years, and during that period it was allowed to have its territorial possessions. But at the same time, the Act asserted the undoubted sovereignty of the Crown of the United Kingdom over the Indian territories. The company was also deprived of its monopoly of trade with India. Its monopoly of the China trade was continued for another 20 years. Christian missionaries were allowed to enter India and were subject to obtaining a license either from the Court of Directors or the Board of Control. The real beginning of Western education in India can therefore be marked with the introduction of the Charter Act of 1813. This act also allocated 1 lakh rupees per year for two specific purposes. First was to encourage the educated natives of India and the revival and improvement of literature, and secondly was the promotion of knowledge of the sciences among the Indians. The fifth act was the Charter Act of 1833. The Act of 1833 became a landmark in the constitutional history of India. In this, it was made clear that the company would be engaged in only political functions. The Indian possessions of the company were to be held in trust for the British Crown. The President of the Board of Control now became the Minister of Indian Affairs, while the board was empowered to superintend all administrative affairs in India. The Governor General of Bengal became the Governor General of India, who would, in consultation with his council, control all civil, military and revenue matters in the whole of India. This Charter Act of 1833 also instructed the government of India to abolish slavery, but the actual forms of bondage in India continued to exist, as they were practiced on the basis of caste, customs and debt. The agricultural labourers continued to be bonded to their landlords in various ways and for a very long time to come. The impact of the legal ban was found to be very limited. The sixth act is the Charter Act of 1853. This act renewed the Charter Act of 1833. It was renewed for 20 more years. This meant that the company was allowed to retain the Indian possessions in trust for Her Majesty. The Act also provided for the separation of the executive and legislative functions of the Governor-General's Council. Competition for the recruitment of the Indian Civil Service was introduced. This curtailed the power of the East Indian Company. This Act more or less removed the East Indian Company in the policy making and established full control of the British Parliament. The seventh Act is the Government of India Act of 1858. This Act followed the revolt of 1857. The main provisions of this Act was to unify the power of the British Parliament. The Governor-General of India was redesignated as the Viceroy. He was answerable only to the Secretary of State. With this Act, India thus passed from company rule to crown rule.